The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome to the Collaborative Gain Council's webinar discussion with Melissa Norcross, newly minted PhD, longtime council member and moderator, and I'm going to introduce her in a moment. But before I do, I just want to say a few words. We've had some great webinars recently. A week ago, we had a discussion with the president of NPR that unfortunately we were not able to record because it was confidential, about their sexual harassment crisis and how they handled it. We have more coming up. We've got a great conversation with the CEO of Foursquare, who rebooted that company and turned it into a big data powerhouse. That'll be later in February or early March. We'll get the dates out to you. We're also doing peer coaching calls literally every single day. And I don't know if everyone knows what I'm talking about, but when a leader has a question, so for example, one of our members just recently became the CTO at IKEA. And her last job, she ran an organization of 400. The new job, she's going to run an organization of 4,000. So we brought 5 CTOs together to coach her on video conference that we moderated for 1 hour. These are 60-minute sessions, and they have been pure gold. The amount of assistance is remarkable. One of our members who sent me an email yesterday for a peer coaching call that we did for her, she's a senior leader in HR at a very large company, said she's so humbled that so many senior leaders would take the time to listen to her situation, ask probing questions, and offer up their best nugget of advice. And it really is a humble environment. And so I encourage, if you have not asked us to set up a peer coaching call for you, you should get in touch with me or any of the Collaborative Gain team. We love putting these together. We have something like 50 coming up. They're only for the person who's asked and the 4 or 5 coaches that we've assembled. But they are indeed pure gold. And there is a fair amount of humility that gets created in the 1-hour conversation that allows for great learning, which helps introduce, of course, the talk that we are going to have today. Melissa Norcross and I first met, what is this, 2019? 23 years ago, actually, when we both entered Harvard Business School as first-year students, and we're actually in the very same section. Melissa did her undergraduate at MIT, has done stints at McKinsey, has been at software companies where she was a CFO and COO, a longtime member and also a longtime moderator of the council. Some of you on the phone I know have had Melissa as a moderator. She's a terrific moderator. And she recently completed a PhD, which, congratulations, Melissa, on your PhD. And so we now have to call her Dr. Norcross. And her research was on humility, and especially thinking about it from a team perspective. And I had a chance to sit in on her dissertation defense with some of the top professors in the world, actually. And it was really quite stunning and remarkable. And I'm so thrilled that you're here with us today, Melissa, to share with us what you learned from your PhD and where you're going next, which actually she's just taken a job in strategy at USAA. And she may end up sharing a little bit about what she's doing there. All right, Melissa, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Welcome.
Thanks. So what I'm going to do today is I'll just spend the next probably 25 to 30 minutes sharing a little bit about humility as a construct and how what my research showed me, what other work is going on that's related to it, and some ways that it may be useful to you. I have a lot of data, but I'm going to gloss over a lot of those things. Just know that there's a great deal of statistical data behind it. And I will do both of us the favor of not diving deeply into it, but if you are a data jock and really need to see it, I'm more than happy to share it with you.
And I'll add, Melissa, that I'll just second the notion that I'm glad we're going to skirt over it today in the call, but it's good stuff there. And I heard her defend her data analysis with one of the top statisticians in the world, and I'll tell you, it was he impressed her. And so it's really there if you want to get deep into it, but we won't go deep today.
No. So let's begin where it started for me. For me, years ago, I had read some work by Collins who talks about a level 5 leader. And he talked about sort of the professional will side of leadership, which is all about getting superb results, this sort of unwavering resolve, and leaders who really set a new standard and have this sort of commitment to excel. But the other half of that, the sort of yin to that yang, is this personal humility that many of those leaders possess. The fact that they looked in the mirror rather than out the window when they were attributing blame. Their ambition was for the group or the company rather than for themselves. And they had sort of this quiet determination to make sure things happened, but that they happened for the benefit of the whole. And they had this presence that was not about their own accolades, but really focused on the success of the organization. And sort of that had been in the back of my mind. And it sort of, but it was this thing that was hard to wrap my mind around because I saw some magic happening in a couple of different areas. And it really came to play when I sat down. I happened to have been working in Indiana at the time, and I sat down with an executive leader who was extraordinarily humble. But he also was able to see very complex things. And as it always happens in the state of Indiana, everything always comes back to basketball. And we happened to have recently been through some extraordinary games in which you saw two different styles of play by two different teams. And ultimately, the team that won exhibited this kind of humility at a group level. And what you saw was, you saw a lot more assists than points scored. You saw a lot more a passing of the ball, a lot more coordination, constantly sort of moving the ball around to whoever was the most open, had the best shot at it. And the other team commented on the fact that they couldn't guard just a single person. And it happened to have been the NBA playoffs between the Warriors and the Cavaliers. And LeBron James was sort of dominating the stats of the Cleveland team. And most of the shots taken were from him. So it was very easy for the other team to sort of double and triple guard him individually. And as a result, they ended up a lot more successful. On the other hand, the other team, which was Steph Curry's team, at the time, there was this sort of group culture of humility that showed up both on and off the court. On the court, what you saw is a broad distribution of shots and points scored by not just one individual, but 3 and 4. You saw much more passing, many more assists. And the statistics really were where it played out. But what was the magic piece of that is you saw this sort of level of like you get in jazz, the sense that they were playing off of one another and there was no single star, that they could riff off of one another. They understood where things were going to go, and it was all about the music and the performance, not about a single individual. And you couldn't really pick out a sole leader in that. And as a result, you had an environment in which the team could really perform. And that sort of started all of this going. And what I realized is that most of our work happens in teams, not at an individual level. Most 90+% of the things we do at work and in any organization are really not as individual contributors. They are as members of teams. And to study some of these constructs and to think about what that means to be sort of what leadership means at an individual level sort of misses the point, right? Because that's not how we work. These days, we work at a group level. And so I had to back up and think about, what does humility mean at the team level? And I can't.
Let me just hop in and say to everyone who's listening, as Melissa's talking, I would love to see some questions pop up on the GoToWebinar control panel, which I may have you, Melissa, address in the moment, although we're going to wait till the end probably for most questions, but start putting them up there in context as we're going through these. So I can call on you later to join us live in the conversation. And it could be a question or, of course, a comment. But go ahead, Melissa, keep going.
Mm-hmm. So humble teams sort of are extraordinarily capable. We never describe someone who's humble we never describe someone who is inept as being humble. Wayne Gretzky is humble. Me playing hockey is not humble. It's realistically modest because I'm terrible, right? I can't skate. So when we describe a leader or an individual or a team as being humble, implicit in that is this extraordinarily high level of performance. But at a team level, what we see happen is sort of this capability that around it, it has this understanding of what they're really good at and what they're not good at. They have sort of this understanding of their own and everyone else's strengths and weaknesses and are able to embrace them. They also have this fierce resolve, this determination to deliver their objectives, but it's a group objective, not an individual goal. And then lastly, they willingly admit mistakes, acknowledge the limitations, they ask for help and feedback, they try and stay open to new ideas and value them. Think about like a surgical team. When the chief surgeon is setting a culture for the entire surgical team of having everyone participate, that's where you get the humility, when other people can offer up their opinions. And Amy Edmondson's research around this and teaming and how teams really work and high-performing teams.
Say who Amy Edmondson is, not everyone I know.
Okay, so Amy Edmondson is a Harvard Business School professor who really has set the new standard for thinking about how teams operate. She looked at medical teams, surgical teams. She even studied in great detail the Chilean mine rescue and what that means. She's tied it to innovation and other things. And so her research really sets a new understanding of how teams work. And you'll see that her research trickle down into the popular press and the other constructs that we tend to get in the business world. And it's already begun, and it will continue to go over the next several years. She really put forward this construct of psychological safety, and I'm going to get to that a little in a little while, because that's one of the things that as leaders, if we create an environment of psychological safety, it enables humility inside of teams. And it allows them to succeed. And she's really the thought leader around that. So this is what team humility means. And you know it when you see it. You also know it if you've ever been a part of it. And what I found when I interviewed people is that those who had been inside a team that was humble never forget it. It stays with them for their whole career. And they're always looking to replicate it. And I did interviews with 25 different executives, and then I surveyed a little over 300 individuals and 150 different teams. And this is the construct that I saw, is that yes, leader humility is impactful, and psychological safety, this sort of sense that it's safe for me to raise concerns and issues, that I can speak up to those in power in a respectful way and be respected by it. Sort of that sense that as a nurse in the surgical unit, I can say, hey, here's something I've noticed that you might want to be aware of to the surgeon, and have them value that rather than shut me down, because I can challenge the authority in that way. Those are important, and they're overlapping environments. But what's really important is the culture inside this humble team. And what we see in that is kinship, this sort of the good side of the mafia, or sort of the Scottish sort of heritage of, we have one another's back and we're in it for the long haul. So you have a family. That sort of good side of the family. Also this attitude of inquiry, that there's this constant curiosity and seeking of new and rich information, so that the way we look at problems can be expanded. The other thing that we see in these humble teams is this extraordinary level of collaboration. It really is in service of the team goal, but the individuals are willing to step outside of their normal roles. We've had stories, some of the stories that I heard were about the CEO or the project leader on an engineering team actually going to the chief engineers and then the programmers' houses and mowing their lawns, because it was more valuable for those engineers to be working on the product than anything else. And they said, look, I know you've got other things going on at home. So literally the CEO went over and mowed their lawn because they needed them on the team. We had marketers stepping outside of their traditional roles and doing other roles that were considered well beneath them. And that was a norm in these kinds of teams. This is sort of a combination of the leaders eat last construct, but also this idea that silos get broken down in that way. And then we saw professional excellence, which is getting back to that original construct of professional will. So that's sort of a group level construct of professional will. And then the shared values, the fact that we have a set of norms and values that are part of the mission that we have as a group.
Would you agree? And just, I believe this is the way you frame it, but to just sort of drive it in a little more. You saw what Jim Collins did, as you said earlier, with Good to Great,
yep.
The level 5 leader. And you said, okay, so this is a focus on an individual leader. How does this work at the team level?
Right.
That's really been your, I think, wonderful contribution to this, and you're walking us through that now. But just, I wanted to sort of help everyone again see that big picture of where this is coming from. All right, so keep going.
It came from there. It also came from a few other sources. Collins' work isn't as rich as we would have liked it. It puts forward a construct, but not necessarily the level of research that we would need to establish it. And so we knew it was there. It just hadn't been academically researched.
Yeah, cool.
So here's what we then did. I then constructed sort of this two-part study. I interviewed 25 different leaders, coded them, and looked for and was able to establish these 5 areas of culture that came up. From that, I developed a large-scale quantitative survey with that I sent out to a little over 300 people and a little over 100 teams, analyzed that statistically, figured out the path by which things happen. That's sort of the overview of my part of the research. And then I put that together with the existing research that existed on the teams front, also on humility and personality. There's been a lot of study and work at the individual level on humility most recently, and also work on hubris. So I pulled all of that together to come up with this. So I'm going to skip over this. We talked about this slide just shows you some of the sources where some of these constructs come from. Obviously, we talked about 3 bolded ones were the themes that came out the most strongly in the research that I conducted. And the kinship really comes from sort of that, you know, Navy SEAL, Green Beret team in the military sense. This attitude of inquiry comes from a whole bunch of different places. And extraordinary collaboration comes a lot from Edmondson's work on teaming. So this is sort of the math, and we'll skip over the math to get to sort of a statistical path. And here's kind of what we found. And this is the important bit of this says, look, here's how at least one path that we think this whole thing works. Here's the why it's important. As a leader, it's not your humility that you model that drives the humility of the team. What does drive it is the psychological safety that you create, which you need to be humble in order to create for your team and your organization. So you create this environment of psychological safety, and then you as an individual set a high standard. That's your own leader professional will. And that in turn impacts the team's humility. That drives both learning behaviors, which is sort of this willingness to learn, to get better, to entertain ways in which you might have gone wrong in the past that you might shift in the future, which then feeds into sort of this long-term performance capability development, which is sort of developing new capabilities that allow you to get better over time. But the direct performance, which is the immediate short-term performance benefits that come from humility, comes from this professional excellence and the notion that when you create a psychologically safe environment, teams are able to set high standards and take appropriate risks in order to get there. So let's take it back to sort of the nurse in the OR who sees the potential for a mistake or thinks about something that she saw in a previous patient. Because it's a safe enough environment for her to speak up and in the moment say, hey, remember when I faced this on a patient 6 months ago. I know you didn't face it, but I faced it, and this is what happened. I'm concerned about us doing this now, so why don't we consider doing this alternate thing? And our ability to do that, and for that individual to surface these concerns and put forth an alternate proposal is dependent upon this psychological safety, the safe environment in which they can speak up. That allows them to get to sort of this better solution. If it's not psychological, there's no way that individual would speak up, because the results of that would be basically they get thumped on the head and say, you know, I'm the surgeon, you will not speak up and be disrespectful in that way. Sort of this authoritarian approach. And so that's sort of the mechanics that we saw identified and unpacked as we do this.
Melissa, I think one of the most surprising things you understood in your diagram here, I believe, shows it, that the leader being humble does not in and of itself create the environment for psychological safety.
Well, my research doesn't prove it. There is other research that has been done that demonstrated the link between those things. However, my research didn't do it, didn't support that. So what it means, one of two things, right? There can be multiple mechanisms by which this happens. So one mechanism might be that very mechanism where leader humility drives team humility. And Owens and Heckman did a couple of studies that seems to indicate that could be possible. However, what my research supported is the fact that there is this other path by which that can happen. So if I was a leader, yes, that humility would be important. And by other research, you would say being humble can affect the team humility. However, there's this alternate path that you have to pay attention to. So if you really want the psychological safety, as a leader, I would do both. And I would really pay attention to creating the psychological safety, because that allows these other things to emerge. We're simply modeling the humility that you have as an individual isn't going to create this path. And
so, Melissa, we actually have a good question that I think we might want to take right now. I know you're not done. But Vaughn Wright has asked a question. Vaughn, I'm going to unmute you.
okay.
Vaughn, are you there?
I am here, yes.
Great. So you asked a good question. What about teams? Can they get to humility without?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the tone. And very interesting to hear you say that the leader doesn't necessarily have to embody the attributes that you recounted that equate to humility. So I'm curious if psychological safety is really what's most important that the leader impart. What are some of the attributes of leader-created environments that I guess are attributed to the psychological safety?
Right. So a lot of the things that we see in a psychological safe environment is this comfort with speaking up, right? So the fact that I think the easiest way to think about it is consider like a military environment in which rank really matters, right? So if we think about a general, if a general creates an environment in which the practice of speaking up, of challenging norms, of bringing in new ideas, of encouraging new ideas, of encouraging looking outside to gather new approaches and applying them, in which all of those things are valued and mattered and rewarded, then they've created this environment of psychological safety where it's okay to speak up. It's okay for the private to tell the major that, you know, using this approach is not going to work. Or they do it a little different over in the Navy and that seems to work a little better. Or, you know, I saw someone doing this and I think there's a better way. I know you told us to do it this way, but I think there's a better way. If the response to that comment is, hey, let's try it, that's a good idea. Thank you for letting me know, whether it ultimately is accepted or not. But if that is appreciated, then you have an environment of psychological safety. When people are afraid to tell you things, afraid to serve up new ideas, afraid to challenge authority, then you have no psychological safety. And you don't necessarily have to be humble in order to create that environment, right?
That's what I was wondering. Like, can you be arrogant and create an environment of psychological safety?
Arrogant isn't necessarily the opposite of humility. There are some aspects that are opposites, but not all. But you do not have to be humble to create psychological safety.
Okay. I mean, take an extreme, like, help me understand this, Melissa. Like, this is one piece that I've always found.
Let's think about a surgeon, right? A surgeon doesn't necessarily have to be humble, right? They can believe they're better than they are. But if, despite that, they value an environment in surgery where people do speak up with new ideas. People do, when they see something start to go wrong, they're not afraid to speak up, even if they're of lower rank than them. That nurse isn't afraid to speak up. Then you have psychological safety, despite the fact that the individual is not humble.
Have you seen real world cases of this? The thing I think about is if your surgeon thinks more highly of their skill than they actually have, that's often driven by insecurity. And insecurity can really wreck psychological safety. If the leader is insecure, they don't want to hear any questioning or challenging to the way things are done.
They may not. But a mature leader, despite the fact that they may not be humble, may be able to create that psychological safety despite that.
Okay. All right. Well,
can I ask, are there any telltale policies or practices? And I don't mean just pure leadership behavior. And the reason I'm asking this is that I've got a piece of work underway trying to determine with publicly available information attributes of more human organizations. And psychological safety is one of those dimensions.
Right.
And trying to look at, are there telltale policies, practices, things that you could identify beyond a given leader's behavior?
So not invented here is a sure sign of lack of psychological safety, right? If only ideas that are internal are ever valued, then there's likely not a lot of psychological safety. If you look at the networks inside and outside the organization, if there isn't a lot of external networks, that's a warning sign that there may not be a lot of psychological safety. Edmondson's book on teaming is a good, it's got several things in the back, and I'd be happy to share some additional things with you offline if you'd like. But the things, if you look at exit interviews, if you look at and you get things like, I was never listened to. Just, a lot of those kinds of things where people aren't listened to, or people know information that they're afraid to surface. And therefore it's sort of a well-known secret. There's a lot of elephants in the room that no one ever talks about. Those are good indicators of lack of psychological safety.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. I went ahead and muted you again, Vaughn. Thanks for those questions. You have a few more things you want to say, and then we can open it up?
Yeah. So this is sort of how humility seems to impact performance. We talked about it. This is just a little more simplified version of it. My research definitely supported a few things. One, it confirmed that humility definitely resonates at a team level with people. If you've experienced it, you know it. It is definitely a construct. And that teams that are humble definitely outperform those that are not. It confirmed the existence of these subcomponents that really hadn't been surfaced before, and confirmed that psychological safety matters. And it matters to both short and long-term performance. And that team outcomes can happen in two ways. If you want team results, make it safe and set high standards. If you want longer term results, that capability development that allows teams to grow, pay attention to the culture and ensure there are learning behaviors that are frequent and common, and that you get psychological humility actually creates this sort of flexibility and adaptability, this kind of resilience. And it sets organizations up to take appropriate risks, to be creative. You get back to that basketball team. It allows them to pass, to try new plays, to deviate and take the risks that you want them to take without taking too many. And psychological safety really enables that appropriate risk taking. And it maintains a commitment to these sort of organizational goals. The big picture is where the loyalty is stuck to. So if we think about sustainable strategic advantage in the sort of very volatile, changing world that we've got, humility is actually an enabling factor for strategic advantage. And these are the ways in which that seems to work. We get less infighting and territorial battles, a lot of positive collective environments where you're looking for good solutions, a lot of building on strengths, and a lot of finding strengths that are present inside the team that then can be leveraged. This sort of attitude of inquiry allows teams to be more open to new ideas and pick up on things that aren't quite right really quickly, usually before damage can be done. And then it sets them up for this really high level of collaboration where innovation and creativity are growing, and the team's goal are superordinate versus the rest of the goals. When we think about humility constructs that drive better collaboration, the sort of kinship and extraordinary collaboration is really about the we versus I. And if you want to tell if your team is humble, that's what I would check for. Is the language that the team uses more I or more we? That's your litmus test. If you've got a pronoun problem, you've got a humility problem.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And then this sort of openness, this willingness to give benefit of the doubt. So when we have an attitude of inquiry, here's the other thing to check for. What are the assumptions that your team makes? Are they good? Are they benefit of the doubt assumptions? When my marketing colleague makes an assumption, do I assume it's because, and it's makes it a problem for me in engineering, do I assume that's because he hasn't been respectful or considerate, he intended to step on my toes and he's power grabbing? Or do I assume he may know something that I don't know, and there's a good reason, and he's probably, to the best of his ability, got my best interest at heart? If I give the benefit of the doubt and I'm curious about what he knows that I don't know that would have made that the right decision, then you've got an attitude of inquiry that's grounded in humility. And if those things are present, those are the things that'll tell you that you have a highly humble, high-performing team. And if you don't, those will be the first indicators that tell you you could have a problem. It does link to some emotional intelligence and empathy models. Goldman is one of the authors of that. And there's some components of empathy that really link back to some of the drivers of humility. But what we ultimately see from environments in which there's psychological safety and there's humble teams, they have these components that then drive better networks, better shared values, a lot of flexibility and adaptability, these sort of nimble, agile teams, and better judgment and decision making. There's more facts coming in, and they're more effectively considered, and a much more organizational learning. And that is sort of a summary of what that research kind of unearthed, and some related research as it plays out. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So let's see what kinds of questions. We've already heard a few of mine and a few of Vaughn's. And this really interesting concept that it's possible to create a humble team even if the team leader is not humble. So what other questions or comments do we have? I'd like to call on a couple of you to join us live. And Vaughn, I know you have another question, but let's see if we can cultivate one or two others here who are on the call. Okay, here we go. Sarah. Okay, great. Sarah, I'm gonna unmute you so you can go ahead and ask your question live. Sarah, are you there?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you so much. And I've thought a lot about creating psychological safety on different teams that I've been on too, and really appreciate this. And for most of my career, I've been on smaller teams as opposed to bigger teams. And one thing that I've noticed or could imagine kind of relating to this is an environment where you don't feel psychologically safe, not because someone is arrogant, but because you don't want, or because someone isn't open to your ideas, but maybe because the environment is known for being nice, in like large corporate environments where you're trying not to step on someone's toes or insult someone.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of feels like the opposite problem to me. And how would you address that issue?
Right. So some of that is born out of just a lack of intimacy, right? So when you're a stranger from someone, you have certain macro assumptions based on the culture, right? So often you can be in a nice environment. You can be afraid to speak up because it might be perceived by the other person or others in the room as being not so nice. And so the way to really overcome that is to develop sort of that kinship and that bond. So what you're able to do is sort of get past that and build those deeper relationships in which you can surface those things without being concerned about the other person or others observers believing that you're intending to offend. It's similarly in a less nice culture, you can have the same things where people assume the worst, right? And so if you speak up, they will assume that you are challenging their authority, trying to usurp their power, or sort of these other negative things. But they all ultimately come down to sort of this lack of kinship and intimacy and empathy. But if you're working in a world where you're trying to build that empathy and that kinship to one another, you can begin to make it safer for those things to be surfaced. And honestly, to try and encourage that kind of a culture, even sort of in these bigger organizations, it needs to happen publicly and, ugly in some ways. So think of the Tylenol issue when, years ago, the head of the company said, as soon as basically they owned the mistake right away, even though it wasn't really their mistake, they did something about it. And that said a lot to the rest of the organization about the fact that if you see something, you say something, and that's valued. So they were able to sort of build at scale this kind of kinship and intimacy because it aligned the whole organization against this greater purpose, is to serve the customers. And so that creates a kind of psychological safety because there's sort of this bigger goal, and it allows the rest of things that don't matter as much to fall away.
Do you have any recommendations on how managers and leaders of larger teams, especially distributed teams, can try to instill some of that intimacy and trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is being extraordinarily transparent. There's a great article on wicked teams and the Chilean. It's Rashid and Edmondson and someone else who discussed what happened with the Chilean mine rescue. And as you know, that was an extraordinarily large team that came together, right? And yet they developed this level of psychological safety that allowed everyone to sort of experience the sense that, you know, hey, we're all in this together, because they made their goals very, very public. Bennis is another one, and Medtronic. If you look at the story of Medtronic and the CEO there, those are other good examples of how individual leaders changed sort of in a much more widespread way, but it really comes down to a lot of over communication of the same thing and walking the talk in a way that's visible for the rest of the organization.
Melissa, if I can, let me add a couple of gems that have come out. So, Sarah, you're new to the councils, and thanks for joining us today. I think you have your first meeting in April, right?
Yeah.
You're at Discovery, and we haven't met before, so welcome. Someone that Melissa will be familiar with, and you might know, Anne Mulcahy, who in 2001 was asked to take over Xerox when they were near bankruptcy, and he did some just amazing things in creating a culture of 90,000 people that allowed for frank discussions at a time when the company was in real crisis. So Sarah, she actually planted questions in the audience whenever she would talk to groups of employees. But the questions she planted were not softballs, which you can, you know, I've seen CEOs do. She would plant the hardest, toughest, most difficult question and get someone to ask that, and she would call on them first to demonstrate that, you know, we need to talk about the hard things and that I can handle that as a CEO and I want your questions. And when she didn't do that, nobody talked about anything real. When she did do that, the entire, even when it was with 1,000 people, the entire group came alive and started addressing the hard questions that everyone was afraid to ask. And so I thought, you know, so, you know, in remote teams, the question is, if you bring everybody together, at least for a call like we're doing now or a Zoom, as a leader, one of the things you can do is think about stuff like that. Another council member at USAA, he will often start his meetings by talking about the mistake that he made that week, what he learned from it, what the consequences were, and what everyone can learn from it. And he's turned some cultures around and created much more psychological safety by actions like that. So maybe there's some creativity there that can inspire you to do something. And if you do, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Cool.
There's another way that one CEO that I know does is he regularly sends a thinking out loud document. It's just sort of a 1 or 2 page when they don't want to get together for meetings, that your willingness to share those hard things and say, you know, this is what I struggle with. This is where I do it. This is how I think about that. That's important. And lastly, Phil mentioned a call that happened with the president of NPR and the challenges that they faced recently with sexual harassment. In her campaign of listening deeply and then reflecting back and sharing not necessarily why it wasn't important or anything else, but basically regurgitating what she heard and the hard things and acknowledging how difficult and how challenged things had been for many of the people and what she heard, just simply reflecting back that she had listened to that and it mattered back to the organization was extraordinarily powerful. And that's another way to make sure people know that it's safe to surface those things because they were clearly valued.
Yeah, that's a great example. All right, we have 2 more questions at least. So Sarah, thank you. George Eberstadt, I'm going to unmute you. So give me a second here while I navigate over there. Let's see, there you are. Unmute. Okay, George, are you there?
Sure am.
Okay, so you had a comment about the pronoun question. Go ahead and share that with Melissa.
Yeah, hi Melissa.
Hi.
So on the we versus I, so agreeing. But one particular thing I have noticed is sometimes we gets used as a dodge for ownership.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the best salespeople I ever worked with was my company. But whenever he talked to customers, it was all I, and I would meet them, and they would say, "You're the founder? I thought he was the founder," and that was great. When he would, when he talked about what we would do for the customer, it was clear that he was putting his neck on the line.
Yeah.
And that was all I. And so I just wanted to, ask, are there limits to we versus I, or places where you want to see people saying I rather than we?
Yeah.
There are. The thing to remember is intent matters as much as anything else. If you're saying, hey, I'm going to do this for you, one of the things to watch out for is to make sure that that individual, because that's a risky strategy, because if that salesman gets hit by the beer truck, there could be a problem, right? Because they don't know there's a deeper organization behind them. You certainly want, just like a team, you want everyone's individual level of ownership to feel that high, that I feel like I'm a member of this team, but that their loyalty and their dedication and their focus is all about we. And I think it gets back to sort of this original rule. I'm sorry for going so fast through these, which is this last 2 bullets on each side. That you look in the mirror to apportion responsibility for problems. That you don't blame other people or external factors or bad luck. And that you look out the window to apportion credit. That the team succeeds. That it was the team's victory. I mean, one good example is Peyton Manning. Despite the fact that he was an extraordinary individual performer, whenever he was asked about what drove a victory, he would almost always focus on the team, not himself. And whenever there was a failure, he would almost always talk about his performance gaps and how that contributed to the failure. And I think that's a good reminder as we think about pronoun usage and what that tells us.
Yeah, great, George. We have one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and you. And I think we could probably spend an hour just on the pronoun question. Really. All right, so Richard Robinson, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, you said you had a question. I don't know the content, so go ahead.
Sorry, it's very quick, and I apologize. I was a little bit late, so you may have covered this, but I'll ask it anyway. And the question is, people want to get credit for their work. How can they do both?
Well, this is sort of one of these weird dichotomies, which is in an environment in which the team values one another, what you find in kinship is that we take joy in, so whenever you've got sort of this humble team in which you do have this kinship, your victory. So if, let's say you and I, let's say Phil and I are on the same team, and there is humility. When Phil launches his book or does something that really contributed to the team, it's more than likely that I am going to be the one advocating for his stellar performance, not for my own, right, contributions. So what you find is that those teams are excited about the successes of the people on the teams, about their peers, and they're just as excited about a team member's breakthrough as they are about their own. And so it becomes possible that individuals aren't fighting for their own accolades. Those accolades happen naturally because of the culture in the team.
Yeah.
You have a lot less jealousy and a lot more advocacy. Like team leaders, humble teams are teams in which a team leader is likely to, if there's good news to be shared, to take another member of the team who is a key contributor to that and bring them and allow them to share the good news. If the bad news is to be shared with the board or whoever that is, team leaders are more likely to take on the bad news sharing, but the good news, the credit, is much more likely to be spread out to the team members and to trickle downhill and to the people that should be getting it.
You know, one of the great examples of that, Melissa, are Warren Buffett's letters to shareholders.
Absolutely.
Exactly does that. By the way, this is Rick Robinson, right?
Yes.
The Richard threw me off. So Rick was a founding member of the councils who has just rejoined. Welcome back, Rick. It's great to hear your voice.
Thank you. Good to hear you too.
Well, good. Are there any other questions? Let me see. I don't think we have any other questions. Yep. So Melissa, we're right at 2 o'clock. Wow. So thank you. Thank you for the great research that you've done here. Really, I think really profound stuff. Excited to see your next chapter, what you do at USAA. She's going to be working in the strategy organization, helping USAA internally, I think, build a culture of psychological safety and team humility. And she'll continue to be working with us as a moderator on the council. So we'll get a chance to see you in April, of course, and if not before that. So congratulations, Melissa. Really
thank
great.
You. Just to close out, I just want to say I've really benefited from participation in this research by a lot of people. It's something I'm pretty passionate about. I continue to speak and write on the topics, not because, but because compelling things happen. Having said that, for anyone who's looking to do anything in this area, I'd like to offer to pay it forward. If there's anything I can do to help you inside your organizations, if you want more resources, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me in the Collaborative Gain directory. Just shoot me an email. I'm happy to meet with you, help you, do anything you'd like. And I'm always looking for ways to help organizations get better. And if I can,
Sarah Adler, I'm sure that Melissa will be happy, as she's saying now, to do a follow-up conversation with you. I had to think about humble teams there at Discovery, and anyone else, Rick or George, of course. So, well, thank you, Melissa. It's really terrific to see the impact that you're having and the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to think about humility.
Yay. So have a humble weekend. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.